Late at night in Arlington, Virginia, the streets were quiet, the hum of distant traffic barely audible. Talia Porter, a strikingly composed black woman in her mid-30s, drove her sleek black SUV through the deserted roads. The glow of the dashboard cast a faint light over her sharp, observant eyes. A former field operative turned covert intelligence analyst, she had spent years maneuvering through the darkest corners of corruption, unseen and unshaken. Tonight should have been a routine drive home, but as she approached a quiet intersection, a squad car emerged from the shadows, trailing her like a predator stalking its prey. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the stillness, blue and red lights flashing in a rhythmic pattern behind her. Talia inhaled slowly. She had been in situations far worse than a traffic stop, but this had the stink of something premeditated. She pulled over, killed the engine, and retrieved her license and registration with deliberate movements. In her rearview mirror, she watched the two officers step out, one tall with a square jaw, the other stockier, his stance exuding unwarranted confidence. Officer Brandon Carter tapped on her window with the edge of his flashlight. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with the kind of practiced authority that didn't invite negotiation. "Know why I pulled you over?" Talia met his gaze without flinching. "No, officer, I wasn't speeding and I made a full stop at the sign." A slow, condescending smile stretched across Carter's face. "Actually, you didn't. That's a moving violation." Talia kept her voice measured. "I'm certain I did. License and registration." Carter's tone hardened. She handed him the documents, watching as he examined them, his eyes narrowing slightly at her name. "Virginia plates. Local address." He glanced at her over the papers. "You live around here?" Before she could answer, his partner, Officer Mark Sullivan, called out from the back of her SUV. "Carter, you might want to take a look at this." Talia's muscles tensed. She hadn't transported anything questionable. Whatever they found, it wasn't hers. Carter strolled to the trunk, his smirk widening as Sullivan theatrically lifted an unmarked bag from the cargo space. "Well, well," Sullivan drawled, holding the bag up like a prize. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little problem." Talia's expression remained unreadable, but inside, her mind was racing. She knew a setup when she saw one. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute," Carter declared, reaching for his cuffs. Talia let them restrain her. She didn't resist, didn't react, except for the faintest hint of a smirk on her lips. "You're making a big mistake," she murmured. Sullivan scoffed. "Yeah? We'll see how confident you are in front of a judge." At the station, Carter and Sullivan paraded her through the precinct, their voices carrying a smug satisfaction. "Caught her red-handed," Carter announced. "She's been running more than stop signs." Talia remained silent as they placed her in an interrogation room, her hands still cuffed. She sat calmly, waiting. She had given them a chance to correct their course. They didn't take it. Now, she would take control. A few minutes later, the door swung open. A man in an expensive suit entered, flanked by two agents in dark suits. "Talia Porter?" the man said smoothly. "I'm Special Agent David Kessler, CIA." Carter's face blanched. Kessler turned to him. "This woman is a federal intelligence officer, and you two just fabricated evidence against her." Silence filled the room like a thick fog. Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sullivan shifted uneasily, his face draining of color. Talia finally spoke, her voice calm but edged with ice. "You two really should have done your homework." Scene 3. The courtroom bombshell. Days later, the courtroom was packed. The trial had drawn significant attention. What had seemed like an open and shut drug case was unraveling into a scandal that could shake the department to its core. Talia sat at the defense table, her posture composed. Across from her, Carter and Sullivan looked far less confident than they had on the night of her arrest. The prosecution played the body cam footage. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Carter and Sullivan were caught planting the bag. Their smirks, their smug exchange, their blatant corruption, exposed in damning detail. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge's expression turned cold. Kessler leaned toward Talia. "They're done." The judge's gavel slammed down. "This case is dismissed. Officers Carter and Sullivan, You are hereby remanded into custody for conspiracy, perjury, and obstruction of justice." As the officers were led away in cuffs, Carter turned to Talia, his face a mask of disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" Talia simply smiled. "Someone you should have never messed with." As she walked out of the courtroom, she didn't look back. Justice had been served, and Talia Porter had made sure of it. Talia remained unnervingly silent, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. Every detail was absorbed in a flash: the placement of the surveillance cameras, the arrangement of the desks, and the almost effortless camaraderie among the officers. It was a small station, the kind where every whisper had a name, and every glance held meaning. Here, secrets weren't just kept, they were shared. This place was a web of unspoken codes, a network of silent understandings where no one was truly who they appeared to be. They guided her to a fingerprinting station. Carter, without a hint of hesitation, removed the cuffs and gestured for her to place her hands on the ink pad. Talia complied without a single word. Her movements were controlled, deliberate, calm, almost unnervingly so. The officer working the station, a younger man with eyes that spoke of late nights and silent exhaustion, paused. He eyed her for a long moment, as though sensing something lurking beneath her composed exterior. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, a slight hesitation in his actions. "Name?" he asked, his voice tinged with quiet curiosity. "Talia Porter," she replied evenly, her voice flat, revealing nothing. "Occupation?" Talia's gaze flickered, a brief hesitation, barely perceptible. She considered her response carefully. It had to be vague enough to evade scrutiny, yet truthful enough to avoid outright deception. "Consultant," she answered at last, her voice smooth as silk. The young officer nodded, his fingers tapping at the keys, though his unease lingered. Carter and Sullivan, however, remained blissfully oblivious. They leaned against the counter, quietly laughing, as if they were in on some joke only they understood. But then, Talia spoke, her voice slicing through their laughter like a blade through silk. Both men faltered, the smugness faltering for just a moment. "You've got a smart mouth," Carter muttered, his tone darkening. "Let's see how funny you are after a night in lockup." Talia's cell was cold and dimly lit. The air was stale, tinged with the faint smell of old concrete. A metal bench bolted to the wall provided little comfort. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, casting an eerie hum across the otherwise quiet space. She sat, her back straight, her posture unyielding, as though she were waiting for something far more significant than a mere prisoner's release. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound of metal against metal echoing down the empty corridor. Carter lingered for a moment outside, his eyes fixed on her with a mix of disdain and thinly veiled curiosity. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this kind of thing," he remarked almost conversationally. "But don't worry. The courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Talia tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she replied, her voice calm but laced with an edge that sent an uncomfortable shiver down Carter's spine. He muttered something inaudible under his breath before walking away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. She was alone, but her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each more important than the last. Leaning back against the cold metal wall, Talia exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling with practiced control. She knew what she had to do next. Every action, every word, every move would have to be precise. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was about to bring something much bigger to light, something that would shake this station to its core. The silence of the cell was broken only by the hum of the HVAC system, the mechanical rhythm that accompanied her thoughts. She sat still, waiting. Her patience was legendary, built from years of experience in the field. She knew that her absence would be noticed soon enough, and when that happened, questions would follow. Her team would find her. They always did. But for now, she was the calm detainee, the unremarkable woman with nothing to hide. Every passing second was another opportunity to gather information. Every rustle of footsteps, every soft murmur of conversation, every click of the station's computers, the details mattered. When the time came, she would be ready. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter bouncing off the walls. "She thinks she's untouchable," Sullivan said with a shake of his head, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Did you see her face? Not even a flicker of panic." Carter's lips curled into a sly grin. "Yeah, well, that'll change. She's just another name in the system now. No one's going to dig too deep." "Besides," Sullivan added, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied sigh, "we've got everything we need. The evidence is airtight." Neither of them noticed the young officer from the processing desk lingering near the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes darting uneasily toward the holding cells. Something didn't sit right with him, but he remained silent. Here, in this place, questioning senior officers wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Back in her cell, Talia closed her eyes, her breathing steady, deliberate. The hours passed, but sleep was a luxury she didn't need. Her mind was razor-sharp, calculating, every thought a calculated move in the larger game unfolding. She was the calm before the storm, the eye of it, waiting for everything to come crashing down. As dawn broke, a pale sliver of light filtered through the narrow, high-placed window of Talia's holding cell. The glow illuminated the cold concrete walls, signaling the arrival of a new day. She hadn't moved much during the night. Sitting upright on the metal bench, her eyes were half closed as though in meditation. Sleep wasn't a part of her routine, not when her mind had to remain alert, constantly calculating, constantly anticipating. The faint hum of voices drifted down the hallway, the station slowly coming to life. She listened, noting the distinct sounds, the shuffle of boots, the hum of the HVAC system, the occasional creak of an officer's uniform as they passed her cell. Every sound told her something, revealed a hidden truth. A loud buzz suddenly broke the stillness, signaling the unlocking of the cell block door. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor, the noise growing louder until it stopped right in front of her cell. Officer Sullivan appeared, clipboard in hand, his ever-present smirk plastered across his face. "Morning, sunshine," he mocked, his voice dripping with false cheerfulness. "Sleep okay? Or was the cot not fast enough for you?" Talia didn't flinch. Her eyes remained steady, unwavering. She had played this game before. Talia met his gaze without a word, her silence more unsettling to him than he cared to admit. She didn't need to say anything. Her quiet confidence spoke volumes, making the air around them thicken with unspoken understanding. Sullivan shifted his weight, trying to maintain his composure, but the subtle shift in his posture revealed the discomfort creeping in. He glanced down at his clipboard, his fingers tapping nervously on the paper. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. He tapped the pen against the paper. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Judges around here don't take too kindly to drug traffickers." Talia tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression a study in calm, but her eyes held an unyielding intensity. "Good to know," she replied softly, her voice steady and unwavering. Sullivan's smirk faltered, the confidence he'd held only moments before slipping just enough for Talia to notice. He cleared his throat, stepping back. "Enjoy your breakfast," he muttered before turning abruptly, walking away with a clipped step, as though eager to distance himself from the uncomfortable tension. Talia remained still, her eyes tracking his movements until he disappeared down the hallway. The cracks in their facade were starting to show. She could feel it. All she needed now was just a little more time. At the front desk, Officer James Keller, fresh out of the academy and eager to prove himself, watched Sullivan with a furrowed brow. Something about the situation felt off, too neat, too convenient. Keller had processed dozens of arrests in his short time at the station, but Talia Porter was different. She wasn't like the usual suspects. She wasn't defiant, nor was she afraid. Her calm, deliberate composure unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. And then there was the bag of drugs. It seemed too convenient, almost placed there intentionally, as if someone had wrapped it in a neat little package for the officers to find. Keller hesitated, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He knew the unwritten rules of the station. Don't question senior officers. But the doubts gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake them. He glanced up at the surveillance monitors above his desk, the live feed displaying the hallway outside Talia's cell. She was sitting on the bench, perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Keller bit his lip, the spark of resolve flickering within him. Meanwhile, Talia made her move. Her hands rested casually in her lap, but her sharp eyes were trained on the camera positioned outside her cell. It was an old model, outdated, probably poorly maintained, something the station's budget didn't prioritize. She waited for the hallway to clear, then shifted ever so slightly on the bench, her movements deliberate but subtle. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small, inconspicuous tracker, standard issue for CIA operatives in the field. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, triggering the device with a barely perceptible click. The tracker sent a silent signal, a beacon that would reach her team within moments. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to explain. Her team would know exactly what to do. In the break room, Carter and Sullivan sat comfortably, sipping their third cups of coffee, laughing over the morning paper. "She's probably sitting in there thinking we're going to crack," Carter said, shaking his head with a smug grin. "They always think they can talk their way out of it." Sullivan chuckled. "Yeah, well, she's in for a rude awakening. This case is a slam dunk. We've got the drugs, the arrest report, and no witnesses. Nobody's coming to save her." Carter leaned back in his chair, the satisfaction clear on his face. "You know what I like about this job? The predictability. You see the same types over and over again. They think they're smarter than us, but they never are." Their laughter echoed through the room, oblivious to the storm silently brewing just beyond their understanding. At a nearby office, a nondescript phone buzzed softly on a desk. A hand reached out, answering it, the voice on the other end calm but authoritative. "Signal received," the voice said. "Location confirmed, deploying resources." Back in her cell, Talia leaned her head back against the cold concrete wall, her eyes closing for a brief moment. She could feel the gears turning, the quiet precision of her team mobilizing in the background. Every second that passed brought her closer to the inevitable reckoning. When the moment arrived, everything would change. She opened her eyes, a faint smile curving her lips, one that held no joy, only quiet certainty. The officers had no idea what was coming. The station bustled with its usual morning activity, officers filing reports, answering calls, and exchanging pleasantries over coffee. It was business as usual for everyone, except for Talia Porter and the two men who had orchestrated her arrest. For Carter and Sullivan, today felt like a victory lap. Talia sat motionless in her holding cell, her posture as composed as ever. Through the bars, she could see the edges of the station's daily rhythm, occasional passing shadows, snippets of conversation. But she remained focused, unmovable. She knew how to blend into the background, to make herself invisible until the exact moment when visibility mattered most. Her signal had been sent hours ago. She trusted her team implicitly, but she also knew they wouldn't act immediately. Timing was everything. In the meantime, she had to sow the seeds of doubt in the right places, specifically at the front desk. Keller's eyes darted back to the holding cell monitors. Talia hadn't moved much, but something about her demeanor gnawed at him. It wasn't fear or defiance, two emotions he was used to seeing in detainees. It was something else entirely: patience, quiet confidence, the kind that seemed misplaced for someone accused of trafficking drugs. Unable to shake his unease, Keller pulled up her file on his computer. Her driver's license information and address were straightforward, but there was an unusual gap in her employment history. The system flagged her most recent job as an independent consultant, but no further details were available. Frowning, Keller minimized the file, glancing toward the break room. Carter and Sullivan were laughing over donuts, their carefree demeanor making his stomach churn. Against his better judgment, Keller decided to dig deeper. He opened the arrest report, clicking through the digital records. The narrative was clear: stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection. The driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk. But something didn't add up. He scanned the report again. It followed procedure, sure, but it felt too clean, too scripted. Keller had been trained to recognize patterns of deception, and this didn't sit right with him. He couldn't explain it, but it felt off. As the hours passed, Keller found himself pacing near the holding cells, glancing toward Talia's cell with increasing frequency. Finally, he worked up the courage to speak. "Miss Porter," he said, stopping just outside the bars. "Miss Porter," he said, stopping just outside the bars. Talia looked up, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "Yes?" she asked, her tone calm. Keller hesitated, his hand resting nervously on his belt. I just wanted to ask, did you really consent to the search of your car?" Talia tilted her head slightly, studying him. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the faint cracks in his resolve. "What do you think, Officer Keller?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. Keller swallowed hard. "I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice faltering. "That's what they're counting on," Talia replied, her gaze steady. "Men like Carter and Sullivan, they rely on people like you to look the other way." Keller's face flushed, and he stepped back, stammering something unintelligible before retreating down the hall. But Talia saw the hesitation in his steps, the conflict etched into his features. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, in the heart of Arlington, a plain black sedan rolled to a stop outside a nondescript building. Inside, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, his movements deliberate. He was flanked by 2 agents, their demeanor professional and alert. "ETA on extraction?" one of the agents asked as they entered the building. The man checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We'll proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we wait." In a secure operations room, live feeds from the police station flickered across several monitors. One screen showed Talia in her cell, sitting perfectly still. Another displayed the front desk where Keller was visibly agitated, pacing back and forth. "Looks like the kid's starting to crack," one agent observed. "Good," the man replied, a faint smile crossing his lips. "We use it when the time comes." As Keller sat at his desk, his mind churned, the familiar knot tightening in his chest. It was a sensation that had been building ever since the arrest. Something wasn't right. A nagging feeling that had been gnawing at him for days, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. His eyes flicked toward the break room, where Carter and Sullivan were still laughing, their carefree demeanor grating against the growing unease that wrapped around him. The station felt heavier than usual, like the walls were pressing in, suffocating him with an unseen weight. It was as if the entire place held its breath, waiting for something. Something unsaid. Something dark. Keller's thoughts wandered back to the holding cell, to Talia's words. "That's what they're counting on." Her voice had been calm, measured, like she knew exactly which buttons to push. And maybe she did. But was she wrong? As the hours dragged on, Keller's doubts slowly transformed into something more, quiet resolve. He needed answers, but drawing attention to himself could be disastrous. His rookie status already made him a target for ridicule, and any sign of insubordination could alienate him further. He had to tread carefully. The moment Carter and Sullivan left the room, Keller wasted no time. He slipped into the records archive, his heart pounding in his chest. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. His hands shook as he logged into the system, searching for cases tied to Carter and Sullivan. The more he dug, the more disturbing the patterns became. Minor traffic violations escalating into drug charges. The names of the defendants repeated over and over, most of them people of color, most of them convicted. Each case was a thread in a web Keller couldn't ignore. His stomach twisted as the knot in his chest grew tighter. Meanwhile, in her cell, Talia remained still, her body a picture of composure. She had trained her mind for moments like this, the waiting, the uncertainty, the high stakes. Through the bars, she could see Keller's shadow moving past her cell. His pacing was slower now, his steps more deliberate. She could feel his internal battle, the war waging within him. He was close, she knew, close to breaking free from the cycle of blind loyalty that people like Carter and Sullivan thrived on. She shifted slightly on the bench, letting her movement catch his attention. Keller stopped, his hand gripping the edge of the wall as if it were a lifeline. "Officer Keller," she said, her voice soft but commanding. He hesitated, his voice low and defensive. "What?" he asked. "You've seen something, haven't you?" She pressed, her gaze unwavering. "Something that doesn't add up." Keller swallowed hard, struggling with the words. "I can't." His voice caught. "I'm just trying to do my job." "And what exactly is your job?" Talia pressed, a spark of challenge in her tone. "To follow orders? To look the other way when you know something's wrong?" His jaw tightened, his eyes darting down the hallway. "You don't understand how things work around here," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I understand more than you think," Talia replied. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, to believe there's no other choice, but there's always a choice, Keller. You have a choice." Her words echoed in his mind as he walked away, the weight of them hanging in the air, following him like a shadow. Back at his desk, Keller sat motionless, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. The list of cases tied to Carter and Sullivan seemed to mock him, each name a reminder of the system he was part of. But something had shifted. He could no longer turn a blind eye. Keller opened a secure email channel, his fingers moving faster now, his resolve hardening. He attached the case files he had found, along with a message. "To whom it may concern, there's something wrong at this station. I don't know who else to turn to. Please help." He hit send, his heart pounding as the message disappeared into the void. He had no idea who would receive it, or if they would even care. But it was the first step toward doing what he knew was right. In the break room, Carter leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup perched carelessly on his knee. "You notice Keller acting weird today?" he asked, glancing at Sullivan. Sullivan shrugged. "Kids are always weird. What's he going to do? Rat us out?" Carter smirked, but his expression darkened. "Keep an eye on him. The last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong." That afternoon, as the station hummed with activity, a nondescript black sedan pulled into the lot. Inside, Talia's team was preparing for their next move. They had intercepted Keller's email, exactly as planned, and now they had what they needed to proceed. "Let's make this clean," the team leader ordered, adjusting his tie. "No unnecessary disruptions. We need to expose this from the inside." As they stepped out of the car, the sun gleamed off their badges. "FBI," one of them muttered under his breath. Inside the station, Keller watched as the agents entered. Their presence was like a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The buzz of conversation faltered, replaced by hushed whispers. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and an unflinching gaze, approached the front desk. Keller's heart raced. Was this it? Had his email triggered the storm? The agent leaned over the desk, speaking low enough that only the desk sergeant could hear. "Federal investigation," the agent said firmly. "We need access to your records and holding cells immediately." The sergeant hesitated, his brow furrowing as he exchanged a glance with another officer. There was no protocol for denying federal agents. "Fine," the sergeant muttered, gesturing down the hallway. "Follow me." Keller watched the exchange, his palms slick with sweat. He had never expected the response to come so quickly. His gaze flicked toward Carter and Sullivan. Their earlier laughter had died, replaced by uneasy murmurs and furrowed brows. Carter's eyes met Keller's for a split second before the rookie quickly looked away, his heart thundering in his chest. The investigation unfolded with relentless precision. The FBI tore through the station's archives, uncovering a mountain of evidence. Carter and Sullivan's arrest records were riddled with inconsistencies, patterned arrests, planted evidence, racial profiling. As Agent Price delved deeper into the case, Keller's worst fears were realized. What he had uncovered wasn't just misconduct, it was a systemic problem. Inside the interrogation room, Carter and Sullivan sat stiffly, the weight of the evidence crashing down on them. Their once confident demeanor had dissolved, replaced by panic. As the truth unraveled, the storm that Talia had foreseen was finally here, and she was right. This was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the fallout from the investigation spread like wildfire. Carter and Sullivan were arrested, their faces plastered across every screen. Their actions, once hidden behind badges of authority, were now exposed for all to see. The station was overhauled, its reputation in tatters. Keller, now viewed as a whistleblower, found himself both praised and shunned by his colleagues. Despite the tension, Keller felt a sense of clarity he had never known. He had done the right thing. The truth had been exposed, and justice had begun to take root. Weeks later, Talia sat in a quiet park, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The weight of the past week seemed to lift with the autumn breeze. Her mission was complete. But as always, there was another fight ahead, and she would be ready. Agent Price joined her, his presence a rare moment of camaraderie. "You could have handled this differently," he said, sitting beside her. Talia smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "And missed the look on their faces? No thanks." Price chuckled softly. "You've got a knack for making things memorable." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their work momentarily forgotten. The storm had passed, but its impact would echo for a long time. Months later, the trial of Carter and Sullivan concluded. The once arrogant officers pled guilty to multiple charges, their careers and reputations destroyed. The cases they had built on lies were overturned, and the innocent people they had wronged were exonerated. The police department was forced to confront its systemic failures, and the community rallied for reform. Keller, though still a rookie, had become a symbol of integrity. Talia, ever the professional, moved on to her next mission, knowing that the fight for justice never truly ended. She had made a difference, and that, in the end, was enough.